Chapter 5. The Revolution and the Peasantry. That ingenious theory about the impossibility of socialism in a single country has been misnamed the permanent revolution. The term is misleading, like many other quasi-Marxist terms used by Trotsky. It is the exact opposite of what Marxism understands by permanent revolution. Trotsky's permanent revolution is an attempt at explaining why a revolution in a single country must fail from within, even if it is not crushed from without. The explanation is that the proletariat has no allies in a socialist revolution within the country where such a revolution takes place. In particular, Trotskyism tries to prove that the peasant masses do not represent a revolutionary reserve, and that therefore a revolution in a single country is bound to succumb to the counter-revolutionary forces, which also include the peasantry, unless aid comes from a victorious revolution in other countries. Trotsky's permanent revolution is thus an expression of the disbelief in the ability of the proletariat to carry with it in the revolution the broad masses of the other exploited and oppressed classes of the population. The Marxian theory of revolution is based just on this conception of the proletariat being the leader of all the exploited and oppressed in the revolution. Hegemony of the proletariat in the revolution is the foundation of the Marxian understanding of revolution. It found its classical expression as early as 1850 in a piece of writing by Marx and Engels entitled Appeal of the Central Committee to the Communist League. In that document, which was addressed to one of the first revolutionary working class organizations in Europe, Marx and Engels pointed out the tasks of a revolutionary workers' party in a revolution such as took place in various countries of Europe in 1848, namely in a revolution against the feudal system. The authors, having in mind the interests of the working class and being fully aware of the fact that a bourgeois democratic revolution, i.e. a revolution establishing a bourgeois democracy, can never satisfy the real demands of the workers, nevertheless did not see the workers as isolated from all the other forces in the revolution. They formulated the task of the workers in the following way. Together with the petty bourgeois democrats against the old system, against the petty bourgeois democrats, together with the village poor when the former wish to entrench themselves and become the ruling power in the state. The document continues, quote, while the democratic bourgeois wish to terminate the revolution as quickly as possible, with the view to confine themselves at best to the realization of only these demands, the demands of the petty bourgeoisie. Our interests and our tasks consist in making the revolution permanent until all more or less property-owning classes have been removed from power, until the proletariat has conquered state power, until the union of the proletarians not only in one country, but in all the leading countries of the world, has developed to such an extent that competition between the proletarians of those countries has ceased, and at least the decisive productive forces are concentrated in the hands of the proletarians. What we are concerned with is not a change in private property, but the abolition of private property. Not softening class contradictions, but abolishing classes. Not improving existing society, but founding a new society." Unquote. We have here, in a remarkably clear form, the meaning of a permanent revolution as understood by Marx and Engels. We, the party of the proletariat, say Marx and Engels, are not interested in terminating the revolution, that is to say, the bourgeois democratic revolution. We are interested in making it a permanent revolution, that is to say, in making it pass from one stage to the other, from a bourgeois democratic revolution to a socialist revolution, from a revolution that tries to improve existing society to a revolution that founds a new society. From a revolution in which the bourgeoisie is the dominant power and holds the means of production, to a revolution where the proletariat is in power and nationalizes all means of production. From a class society to a classless society. Marx and Engels also point out the desirability of a permanent revolution from a class society to a classless society. But while the bourgeois democratic revolution is in progress, the workers must not forget that they are the leaders of all the exploited. Quote, as in the First French Revolution, the petty bourgeois will give over the feudal estates to the peasants as free property, i.e., they will wish to retain the rural proletariat and create a petty bourgeois peasant class. The workers must counteract this plan in the interests of the village proletariat and in their own interests. They must demand that the confiscated property should become state property, and should be transformed into workers' colonies that are cultivated by the village proletariat, organized in associations, and utilizing all the advantages of large-scale agriculture. Under conditions where bourgeois property relations are being shaken, the principle of public ownership will thus be placed on a firm basis. As the Democrats unite with the peasants, so the workers must unite with the village proletariat." Unquote. We have here the sketch of an alliance of the workers with the other exploited and the defense of the interests of the latter in the revolution. The theory and practice of the hegemony of the proletariat in the revolution were developed and perfected in the Russian Revolution by the Bolsheviks with Lenin. Absolutism reigned in Russia. The system was semi-feudal. Power was in the hands of the landed aristocracy and a powerful bureaucracy. The Tsar considered himself the foremost landowner. When capitalism developed in the last quarter of the 19th century, Tsarism reluctantly yielded a few governmental positions to the representatives of the wealthy manufacturers and bankers. A new industry with a modern proletariat had come into being, but strong remnants of feudalism reigned in the village. The peasants did not even possess the full right to choose their place of living. The landlords had privileges over the peasants reminiscent of those under serfdom. The broad masses of the population, workers, peasants, lower middle class of the cities, had almost no political rights. Time came when the revolution appeared inevitable. It was in the interests of the workers and of the other exploited masses that the working class should take the lead, the hegemony, in the revolution. This is what the Bolsheviks fought for. What shall the working class demand of the coming revolution? They asked. What is its task in the revolution? The socialists of the Menshevik brand, social reformists, believed that the only thing the revolution could accomplish was the establishment of a democracy after the English or French pattern. The Mensheviks said that the workers should content themselves with constitutional liberties and participation in a bourgeois parliament. This, they thought, was the maximum anybody could wish under the given conditions. As to the introduction of socialism, they relegated this to the dim and distant future. If ever they thought of socialism, they saw it coming, by degrees of course, and without violent upheavals, in perhaps 100 or 200 years after the bourgeois democratic revolution. In fact, they never thought of socialism in connection with the revolution that was the order of the day. Quite different was the attitude of the Bolsheviks with Lenin at their head. As early as 1894, in winding up his treatise, Who Are the Friends of the People, in which he defines the role of the proletariat and its party, Lenin says, quote, "When the proletariat's advanced representatives will have assimilated the ideas of scientific socialism, the idea of the historic role of the Russian worker, when these ideas will have become widespread, and there will be created among the workers stable organizations which transform the now sporadic economic warfare of the workers into a conscious class struggle, then the Russian worker, rising at the head of all the democratic elements, will throw down absolutism and lead the Russian proletariat, hand in hand with the proletariat of all countries, on the straight road of open political struggle to a victorious communist revolution." Unquote. Here we have a complete outline of the theory of the permanent revolution. The proletariat is marching at the head of the other democratic elements toward a bourgeois democratic revolution. Together with these elements, it overthrows absolutism and establishes a bourgeois democracy. It does not stop at that, however, but continues fighting until it overthrows the capitalist system and establishes communism. This is the Leninist formulation of the permanent revolution. It consists of two elements. First, the proletariat is leading the other elements of the exploited. The proletariat is, quote, "the only and the natural representative of the toiling and exploited population." Second, the revolution passes from the first to the second stage, from its bourgeois democratic to its socialist stage. This approach to the permanent revolution implied the idea of a revolutionary alliance between the city workers and the peasants. And just a comment here, we've covered this topic many times in previous audiobooks and discussions. Coming out of feudalism, the bourgeoisie tend to take the lead, proclaiming to all of the other classes in society that they are freedom fighters and that they're rallying the whole society to break out of feudalism and establish something new. But really, the bourgeoisie, as we know, wants to set up a system whereby they are the new exploiters. So the Marxist idea here is to go that far and then keep pushing. Don't let the bourgeoisie or the capitalists stop you. Because at some point they will say, okay, that's enough freedom, everybody's good. And you'll say, no, we're still exploiting. Actually, you're the ones exploiting us. And they'll say, yeah, but that's okay. And you'll say, no, it isn't. And then you keep pushing. And that's the road to the socialist revolution. So 1850, under no pretext, the text that quote comes from, Marx laid out the entire blueprint for this. When the bourgeoisie have their revolution, the proletariat should set up a parallel workers' government. And, that was 1850. A lot of the proletariat was maybe not ready to hear that and get organized. But 50 years later, by the early 20th century, there had been enough time for this thought to be disseminated and mature and be digested. And the Russian Revolution was able to do exactly that. So ideally, you would want to hit the bourgeoisie when they're still embryonic. Again, exactly as the Russian Revolution did. What we are dealing with today in the imperialist countries is a very well-established capitalism that has all of its police, has all of its surveillance, is experienced, and is generally a pretty tough nut to crack. They have beaten back the labor movement in the US, basically made any kind of effective labor action illegal. So we're probably going to be fighting them in their extreme decline. Just as you would ideally want to hit them when they're just setting up, we're going to be hitting them probably as they fall apart, like completely. But it still requires us to get very organized. All right, continuing. Lenin's Bolshevik argument, as formulated more than once during 1905 and in subsequent years, runs as follows. The liberals, representing the bourgeoisie, are in favor of the revolution, but in an inconsistent, selfish, and cowardly manner. As soon as its narrow, selfish interests are satisfied, the bourgeoisie as a mass will turn its back to the people, to the revolution, and will join hands against them with autocracy. Comment, having established their own dominance against the outgoing ruling class, what we've seen in history is that the capitalists will not get rid of them completely, but tend to cement their rule by anchoring themselves with certain elements of the old feudal order. So you get these vestiges like religion, maybe vestigial monarchies, things like that, which although it is a bourgeois task to abolish these things, they do keep them around as weapons against any future freedom fighting against themselves. This would be useful to deploy in times where they feel themselves under crisis, such as now. And there definitely is room for the crisis that is current to go much, much deeper. But 2008 was a real sea change, and they've been doing some pretty desperate maneuvers to try to forestall another crash. My current concern is that this full court press that the Trump-Musk administration has been launching in its first 5 or 6 weeks is basically the capitalists trying to shore themselves up against the fallout from a crash that they expect in the next couple of years. So stay watchful. Continuing, who then will remain after the capitalists have joined hands with the outgoing autocracy? The proletariat and the peasantry. Even when we deal with a democratic revolution only, it is clear from the very outset that the proletariat alone is capable of bringing such a revolution to its logical conclusion, because the proletariat goes much further than that. The proletariat alone is the unwavering and unyielding element in the revolution. The peasantry is unstable because it contains semi-proletarian, which is to say partly self-employed and partly employed people, and petty bourgeois elements. But the instability of the peasantry differs radically from the instability of the bourgeoisie. The peasantry is not interested so much in constitutional guarantees for private property as in taking away from the landowners the land, one of the mainstays of private property. Lenin therefore taught that it was the task of the proletariat to unite with the peasantry in order as far as possible to drive forward the bourgeois democratic revolution. This, he said, could be accomplished by uniting with the peasantry as a whole. As soon as the bourgeois democratic revolution is accomplished, the proletariat, in alliance with the semi-proletarian elements of the peasantry, i.e. with the poorest peasants, he said, will be able to carry through the abolition of capitalism, thereby overcoming the resistance of the bourgeoisie and the richer peasants. The plan was sound. It was in accordance with the social forces as they existed in Russia and in full harmony with the doctrine of Marx and Engels. In order that the transition from a bourgeois democratic revolution to a socialist revolution might be possible, Lenin said, power must not be allowed to pass into the hands of the bourgeoisie at all. In other words, even in the bourgeois democratic revolution, the bourgeoisie must not be allowed to become the ruling class. Power must pass into the hands of the victorious workers and peasants who established the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. As soon as the proletariat is strong enough, as soon as conditions are favorable, it proceeds to the next stage, to a socialist revolution. Then it establishes the dictatorship of just the proletariat. We thus have, in Lenin's conception, 2 stages of the revolution. 1, the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, and immediately following it, 2, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Why the former? Because it is necessary to break the resistance of the landowners, the rich bourgeoisie, and the Tsar's officialdom, and for that, you need an alliance with all the peasants. Quote, without the revolutionary democratic dictatorship, it is impossible to break this resistance, to repel the counter-revolutionary attempts. But of course this will be not a socialist but a democratic dictatorship. It will not be able to touch upon the foundations of capitalism. That is, without a whole series of intermediate stages of revolutionary development. At best, it will be able to introduce a fundamental redivision of land property in favor of the peasantry, to carry through a consistent and full democratism up to and including a republic, to eradicate all Asiatic slave features not only from village life but also from factory life, to make the beginning of an earnest improvement of the situation of the workers and of raising their standards of living, and last but not least, to transfer the revolutionary conflagration to Europe. Such a victory will by no means make our bourgeois revolution a socialist revolution. The democratic overthrow will not immediately reach beyond the framework of bourgeois social-economic relations. Nevertheless, the significance of such a victory will be gigantic for the future development both of Russia and of the whole world. Nothing will so much arouse the revolutionary energy of the world proletariat, nothing will so much shorten the road that leads to its full victory, as this decisive victory of the revolution that has begun in Russia." Unquote. Will there be a long interval between the first and the second stage of the revolution? Of course, delays are possible. Defeats are sometimes unavoidable. At the time when the above lines were written, which is July 1905, the outcome of the then developing revolution was far from certain. Lenin himself stressed the fact that he was, quote, "not inclined to senseless optimism on this score," that he realized, quote, "the tremendous difficulty of this task. However," he said, quote, "we must wish for victory and know how to show the real way to it." This way, as pointed out by Lenin, was an immediate transition from the bourgeois democratic revolution to the socialist revolution. Quote, "From the democratic revolution we will immediately begin, just in accordance with the measure of our strength, the strength of the conscious and organized proletariat, to pass over to the socialist revolution. We stand in favor of the permanent revolution. We shall not stop midway, without lapsing into adventurism, without being unfaithful to our scientific conscience, without running after cheap popularity. We can and do say only one thing. We will, with all our power, help the entire peasantry to carry through the democratic revolution, in order that we, the party of the proletariat, may be the easier enabled to pass, as quickly as possible, to a new, higher task, the socialist revolution." Unquote. Help the entire peasantry carry through the democratic revolution. The meaning and content of the democratic revolution for the Bolsheviks consists in abolishing, in relation to the peasantry, all remnants of feudalism. Once this is accomplished, once power is in the hands of the proletariat and the peasantry as a whole, once the resistance of the formerly ruling classes has been broken, once the proletariat has, in the process of the revolution, grown stronger and better organized, the road is open to the socialist revolution. The road will be traveled by the proletariat in alliance, not with the peasantry as a whole, because the rich peasants will naturally be against the socialist revolution, but in alliance with the semi-proletarian elements of the population. Here is Lenin's classic formula, quote, "The proletariat must carry through to the very end the democratic revolution by attaching to itself the mass of the peasantry in order to crush by force the resistance of autocracy and to paralyze the instability of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat must accomplish the socialist revolution by attaching to itself the mass of the semi-proletarian elements of the population in order to crush by force the resistance of the bourgeoisie and to paralyze the instability of the petty bourgeoisie." Unquote. We have dwelt at length on the Leninist theory of permanent revolution because only on this basis is it possible to judge Trotsky's perversion of the theory of permanent revolution. The Trotsky thing is in substance a negation of the proletarian revolution. He clings to it thinking that this is his own contribution to the science of revolution, but in reality it's a piece of Menshevism garbed in pseudo-revolutionary phrases. Comment, we just posted an audiobook yesterday from a collection titled Lenin on Petty Bourgeois Revolutionism called The Revolutionary Phrase, which is Lenin on the subject for about a half-an-hour audiobook. This is really important to understand to get at the real nature of this phenomenon, because Lenin over years in many different articles referred to Trotsky as a phrasemonger. And this is what he meant by that, quoting the revolutionary phrase, "By revolutionary phrase making, we mean the repetition of revolutionary slogans irrespective of objective circumstances at a given turn, in the given state of affairs obtaining at the time. The slogans are superb, alluring, intoxicating, but there are no grounds for them." Lenin also said that revolutionary phrase-making, more often than not, is a disease from which revolutionary parties suffer at times when they constitute, directly or indirectly, a combination, alliance, or intermingling of proletarian and petty bourgeois elements. So this is basically an artifact of petty bourgeois thought when the revolutionary course is, as Lenin said, quote, "marked by big rapid zigzags." They get lost and start idealistically spouting lots of ultra-left phrases which advance too quickly given the actual circumstances. Continuing, Trotsky stated his quote-unquote theory in the following way, quote, "The Russian proletariat, finding itself in possession of power, even if this were only a consequence of a temporary combination of forces in our bourgeois revolution, will meet with organized hostility on the part of world reaction, and with readiness for organized support on the part of the world proletariat. Left to its own forces, the working class of Russia will inevitably be crushed by the counter-revolution the moment the peasantry will turn away from it. Nothing will remain for it but to link up the fate of its political domination, and consequently the fate of the entire Russian Revolution, with the fate of a socialist revolution in Europe. That colossal state political power which it gets from the temporary combination of forces in the Russian bourgeois revolution, the working class will thrust upon the scales of the class struggle of the entire capitalist world. With state power in its hands, with the counter-revolution behind its back. With the European reaction in front of it, it will issue to its brothers the world over the old battle cry, which this time will be the battle cry of the last attack, "Workers of the world unite." That's quoting from Trotsky's Summing Up and Perspectives, 1906. The style is dramatic, but the content's defeatist. If one is to assume that the working class of Russia is alone, that it has no allies, then it cannot get into possession of state power at all. If one is to assume that by some miracle it has gained power, but that European reaction is in front of it, and 9/10 of the population behind its back are hostile, then of what avail can be the battle cry? Revolutions, even when conditions are ripe, take time to develop. The battle cry of the proletariat that is beset by enemies may not immediately arouse the workers of other countries. Moreover, a similar class situation prevails in some other countries as well. There too, the peasantry forms a large part of the population. There too, according to Trotsky, the workers must have the counter-revolution behind their back and the world reaction in front of them. A revolution, according to Trotsky, is an impossibility in a single country. To take an example nearer to home, in the United States we have an industrial proletariat in manufacturing, mining, and transportation, which forms a large section but by no means the majority of the population. There are tens of millions of small and middle farmers, small traders, petty bourgeois intellectuals, a huge part of the people. Quick comment there, the class composition of the U.S. has shifted since 1935, and now a much larger section of the population is proletarian. Continuing, it follows from Trotsky's original idea that the workers could not have the support of these millions in a revolution against capitalism, that they would inevitably unite with the exploiters against the revolutionary proletariat. It follows that there could be no hope for a revolution under any circumstances. The champion of what he calls permanent revolution champions permanent defeat. The Bolsheviks knew that in Russia, as in any other capitalist country, the proletariat was the only consistently revolutionary class, and they worked to secure its hegemony, its leading role in the revolution. Yet they also knew that the peasants were an inexhaustible reserve of revolutionary energy, and their estimate proved true. Leading the land-hungry peasants, in uniforms as soldiers or without uniforms as semi-serfs, was it possible for the proletariat to accomplish the February 1917 revolution, in which the Tsar was deposed, leading not the peasantry as a whole, but the poorest peasants who were both against the capitalists of the cities and against the capitalists of the village, i.e. the rich peasants, kulaks, and with the middle peasantry neutralized, was it possible for the proletariat, with the Bolshevik Party as its vanguard and all power to the Soviets as its slogan, to accomplish the October 1917 revolution which established the dictatorship of the proletariat, leading the millions of the poorest peasants who willingly joined the Red Army to defend the conquests of the revolution? Was it possible for the proletariat, with the Bolsheviks at its head, to win the Civil War and secure the final victory of the revolution? History has eloquently refuted Trotsky's permanent revolution, yet he never relinquished this stupid concept, which, by the way, is not even his own invention. It was first advanced by a social democrat by the name of Parvis, who later turned violent social patriot during the World War. Its basic idea that the peasantry as a whole is counter-revolutionary is a Menshevik conception. Years pass. Revolutions come and go. First the 1905 revolution, then the period of counter-revolution, then the period of upswing, then the February Revolution, then the October Revolution. Huge masses of peasants are drawn into the revolution and give it that mass character which is requisite for victory. Collectivization of agriculture is introduced. The kulaks are liquidated as a class. The difference between middle and poor peasant disappears due to common membership in the collective farm. But our pessimist still holds fast to his idea of the peasantry being ultimately hostile to the revolution. He learns nothing. In 1909, he foresees a situation where the workers in power, once undertaking to introduce a number of socialist measures, would inevitably come into conflict with the peasants. Quote, the conflict, he says, must end either by the workers being chastised by the peasant party or by the latter being removed from power. Unquote. That's from Our Controversies, reprinted in the book 1905. It doesn't enter Trotsky's mind that the proletariat may introduce such measures as would elicit the support of the large masses of peasantry and thus ensure a united march towards socialism. Again, in 1905, in the Paris paper Nasze Slovo, he emphasizes the fact that one must not cherish, quote, exaggerated hopes concerning the peasantry's revolutionary role, unquote. Again in 1922, after 5 years of dictatorship of the proletariat so replete with the experiences of peasant masses supporting the revolution, he writes a preface to a collection of his articles which is published under the general title 1905, in which he says, quote, "It was during the interval between January 9 and the general strike of October 1905 that the views on the character of the revolutionary development of Russia, which came to be known as the theory of the permanent revolution, gradually crystallized in the author's mind. This somewhat complicated term represented a rather simple idea. The revolution would not be able to solve its immediate bourgeois problems, except by placing the proletariat in power, and the latter, upon assuming power, would not be able to limit itself to the bourgeois framework of the revolution. On the contrary, precisely in order to secure its victory, the proletarian vanguard would be forced, in the very early stages of its rule, to make deep inroads not only into feudal property but into capitalist property as well. In this, the proletariat will come into hostile collision, not only with the bourgeois groupings which supported the proletariat during the first stages of the revolutionary struggle, but also with the broad masses of the peasants who were instrumental in bringing it into power. The contradictions in the situation of the workers' government in a backward country with an overwhelming majority of peasants can be solved only on an international scale, on the arena of the world proletarian revolution." Unquote. Trotsky still clings to his simple idea to this very day. The idea has made Trotskyism the vanguard of counter-revolution. Need one argue against it? The lessons of history are clear enough. Not only would the conquest of power and the repulsion of the capitalists and landlords have been impossible for the proletariat of Russia without the aid of millions and millions of peasants, but the upbuilding of socialism would not have been possible either. Socialism, said Stalin, is not something peculiar to the towns alone. Socialism is an organization of economic life that can be established only by cooperation of industry and agriculture, on the basis of socializing the means of production. Socialism is impossible without union between industry and agriculture. Agriculture means not only land and implements, but in the first place, peasants, living millions of peasants. When the proletariat, under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, expropriated the manufacturers and bankers in the early stages of the socialist revolution in Russia, who was it that formed its armed force? The Red Army, in which the peasants formed a large part. When the rebellions of the kulaks against the Soviet power on the Volga and in many other districts of Russia had to be quelled in 1918 to 1920, who did it? The same Red Army, in which the poor and middle peasants were numerically strong. When the proletariat began to de-kulakize the rich peasants with the introduction of collectivization in the villages, who was its main support and who were its allies? Its main support were the poorest peasants, in whose interests it was to carry out such expropriation. Its allies were the middle peasants. Suppose there were an attack upon the Soviet Union. Who would be in the first ranks of defense? The Red Army, which consists of workers and collective farmers. What is there to the Trotsky peculiarity of the permanent revolution? It is an exploded idea. It is counter-revolution of a peculiar kind. It is in contradiction to widely known and undisputed facts. It is in contradiction to Lenin's understanding of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Quoting Lenin, the dictatorship of the proletariat is a special form of class alliance between the proletariat, the vanguard of the toilers, and the numerous non-proletarian strata of the toilers, the petty bourgeoisie, the small craftsmen, the peasantry, the intelligentsia, etc., or the majority of these. It is an alliance against capital, an alliance aiming at the complete overthrow of capital, at the complete suppression of the resistance of the bourgeoisie and of any attempts on their part at restoration, an alliance aiming at the final establishment and consolidation of socialism." Unquote. Trotsky's theory sounds revolutionary only to the uninformed. It implies that the sharecroppers of the South and the USA will turn against the workers the moment they begin, after the seizure of power, to take away the mines and mills from the capitalists of, say, Alabama. That the tenant farmers of the Middle West will join the armies of Morgan and Ford to fight the taking over by the workers of the automobile plants, railroads, and banks. That the large mass of the small citizenry of New York will turn against the workers introducing socialist measures in this world metropolis. This is what the blind failed to notice in Trotsky's variety of Menshevism, as it was called by Stalin. Trotsky does not stop at this peculiarity, however. That is only his base, his starting point. He draws from it peculiar conclusions, each more fantastic than the other. What follows from a wrong premise is a number of counter-revolutionary conclusions which make up the main features of Trotskyism. 1. The basis is the impossibility of socialism in one country. 2. Hence, the assertion that what is going on in the Soviet Union is not socialism. 3. Hence, the conclusion that what is being built in Russia is, quote, national socialism. 4. Hence the conclusion that the National Socialist government of the Soviet Union is Thermidorian, i.e. counter-revolutionary, and stands in the way of the world revolution. 5. Hence the assertion that the Communist International, which is dominated by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which is the party of National Socialism, is blocking the way of the world revolution. Hence the conclusion that the crying need of the world proletariat is to build a fourth international to be led by the great strategist of the revolution, Leon Trotsky. 7. It follows from the above that support of intervention and the killing of Soviet leaders are revolutionary acts. As you see, there is logic in these ravings. They all follow with ironclad necessity from the fountainhead of the Trotskyite denial of socialism in a single country. That they do not happen to tally with historic facts is not the Trotskyites' fault.